All right, it's time for part 2 of my preview video, so let's get right into it. Now, this was revealed a couple days back, but I didn't catch it. The commanders for the precons have been revealed, or at least a few of them. So let's go ahead and look at those right now. First up is Morska, Undersea Sleuth. It's Bant color 2/3 Vidalcan Fish Detective, which I think is a very weird typing, but whatever. You have no maximum hand size, beginning of upkeep, you investigate, and then when you draw your second card, each turn put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. So this almost feels like a Voltron-ish commander. So if you don't know what that is, that means that you build your commander up to 21 damage or over time build up 21 damage on a player, hit them, and they'll lose the game, because if your commander does 21 damage, that's game over. So in this case, it kind of has a built-in way to draw your second card each turn. And if you're doing other clue tokens and other kind of card draw things, you can build this up pretty quick, because you can draw, it's on each turn. So you can just be like, okay, I'm going to draw my second card on my turn. I'll pop a couple clue tokens on your turn, and then I'll do it again here, or I'll do an instant speed draw spell somewhere else. So you could feasibly, if you had enough mana, put about 8 counters on this every turn cycle, including your own turn, and then going around the board. Not bad, but not like spectacular. I like this card, but I'm not like as impressed as I was with the Lost Caverns commanders. And then we have Nelly Borka, Impulsive Accuser. For 4 mana, you get a 2/4 human detective with a vigilance that says when it attacks, suspect target creature and then goad all suspected creatures. Whenever one or more creatures an opponent controls deals combat damage to one or more of your opponents, you and the controller of those creatures draw a card. So the idea here is you're going to be goading your opponent's stuff. They're going to be attacking each other, and then the controller of the card and you get more card advantage as long as they're actually making contact with your opponent. And then at the same time, you're suspecting these things. So you're actually giving their creatures menace and can't block. So you make it so this can get through because they're not able to block it if you suspect one of their creatures. So it kind of has like a built-in safety net on itself. And then on top of that, when those goaded creatures go to attack, you're going to go ahead and give them menace, and they're going to be able to get through easier on your other opponents as they swing at each other. So this is kind of interesting. I kind of like it. It's much, much different than a lot of Boros commanders, because most Boros commanders are just straight up, okay, it's equipment and does things. Not exactly the most interesting stuff in the world. This is a little more interesting, and so far I like this one better than the last commander we looked at. Then we have Mirko, Obsessive Theorist. For 3 mana, you get a 1/3 Vampire Detective with Flying and Vigilance, and it says whenever you surveil, put a +1/+1 counter on him. And at the beginning of your end step, you may return target creature card with power less than Mirko's from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. Now, finality counters were introduced in the last set, and what it is they come back from the grave, and then if they die again, they're exiled for good. So it's a reanimator for the Dimir. It's kind of neat. I like it. You can go ahead and you can boost it with the +1/+1 counters, or you can use Anthem style effects, or even equipment, because it doesn't look at the counters, it just looks at the actual power. So if you put like a +3/+0 equipment on him, you're going to get something bigger and bigger as you go along, plus all this other stuff. And black-blue is the Surveil color combo. So this works out really good there. He's pretty decent. I kind of want to try him out. I'm kind of hoping that they put these commanders on the Arena client like they did with the other ones from Lost Caverns, because these look like they're about the same power level, maybe slightly less. So we'll see what they do. And then the last one that they've shown so far out of those decks is Kaust, Eyes of the Glade. It's a hybrid white-red with a green 2/2 Dryad Detective that whenever a creature you control that was turned face up this turn deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So it works really well with all of the disguise stuff. So I'm guessing that precon is about disguise creatures. And of course it also works with morphs and megamorphs. So you turn those things over and then they hit and you draw a card, and then you can turn target face down attacking creature you control face up. So if you have something that has a high disguise cost or a high morph cost to flip over, just tap him and flip him over and boom, you're done. Now that said, you will not get any kind of special abilities off of the disguised creatures if there's like an additional payment, like that angel we looked at yesterday that has the X cost on it. If you flip that over with him, you're not going to get to exile anything because the X cost will be 0. You don't get to pay that and flip this over with this. You have to pay the full cost to do that. He's kind of interesting, but he's kind of limited in what he does. And the problem is they've already done a morph deck a few years back, and it was a Sultai color combination. So only the green part of that deck carries over. So you're not gonna get anything from that particular deck that's not just mono green or colorless to actually work in this kind of setup. So we'll see how this goes, but I'm not very impressed with this particular commander. Then we have the Case of the Stashed Skeleton for 2 mana. Enters the battlefield, creates a 2/1 black skeleton token, and you suspect it. So it's a 2/1 menace and can't block. And then to solve it, you control no suspected skeletons. So there's a couple ways to get away with this. You can either have a way to remove the suspect counter from it, which there are a couple of things that will allow us to do that we've seen in the set so far, or you sacrifice that skeleton so it's gone. And then the solved side of it is pay 2, sack the case, search your library for a card, put it in your hand, then shuffle, activate only as a sorcery. So it has demonic tutor attached to it if you solve the case. So as long as you have a way to sacrifice or get that counter off the skeleton, you have a way to get a demonic tutor that just kind of sits there. So if you have like something that cares about enchantments, permanents being in your deck, like that Myco Tyrant deck I did, once again, this would be pretty good in that deck because it will allow me to have a tutor in the deck that doesn't rely on an instant or sorcery to actually do this. And this, what's nice about this too, is this would also work really well with Muldrotha because you get a permanent, because she can recast permanents from your graveyard. So you get to cast an enchantment from your graveyard, the case, and then if you are able to solve it, you get to sacrifice it, look for something, it goes back to your grave, and then you can recast it again later down the line. So this is kind of interesting in that kind of build. Then we have Pyrotechnic Performer for 1 and a red. It's a 3/2 Viashino Assassin with Disguise of red. So you play it down as a 2/2 for 3 with Ward 2, and then you just pay a red and flip it over. Whenever it or another creature is turned face up, that creature deals damage equal to its power to each opponent. So essentially, this is Lightning Bolt. Straight up. You can flip it over for a 1 red and it lightning bolts something. So that is really, really good. Now, you can't lightning bolt creatures because this only does to your opponent, but that's really good. And it does it with any kind of stuff that has that flip over ability, whether it's morphs, megamorphs, or the new disguise creatures. So you could build a deck filled with these disguise creatures, have this guy be part of the rig up, and you just flip it over and just start blasting away at stuff. That is really, really good. And just, you can do a lot of ancillary damage just for flipping over your disguise creatures with this guy sitting around. Then we have Assemble the Players for 1 and a white enchantment. You may look at the top card of your library at any time, and once each turn, you may cast a creature card spell from your library with power 2 or less. So you get to look at the top card of your library. You can cast it at any time that you're able to cast it. Now, it doesn't grant flash. I saw somebody ask that online. It does not grant flash, but if you have a legend or something else that grants flash to all your creatures or grants flash to at certain points in the game, you can flash them off the top of your deck and you can do it once a turn. I could see this in something like, I don't know, Elas Ilkor, or if you had a Lurrus deck of some sort, since you're playing with power, low to the ground 2 drops or whatever. There's a lot of different options with this particular card. I'm planning on seeing some play somewhere. Then we have the Talk of the Town. This card is going to be expensive because it's going to see play in competitive formats, including CEDH. Delny Streetwise Lookout. For 3 mana, you get a 2/2 human scout. Creatures you control with power 2 or less can't be blocked by creatures power 3 or greater, so that allows them not to sit back on a big creature and eat your little guys. And then if an ability of a creature you control with power 2 or less triggers, it triggers an additional time. So the big one that everybody's looking at is Dockside Extortionist, because it is a 1/2, and when it enters the battlefield, it triggers creating those treasures. Well, it'll trigger twice, so it's kind of silly. And yeah, there's all kinds of little power 2 or less creatures out there that can trigger multiple times on things. Somebody else pointed out Venerated Rot Priest. Its trigger for when your creatures get targeted, you put poison counters on players. This will cause that thing to trigger twice. So you target it with a pump spell, and all of a sudden you're going to have multiple poison counters getting delivered out to your opponents. It's kind of silly. And this card, like I said, this card is probably going to be expensive. If you get your hands on one, hang on to it because it's going to probably see a lot of use in a lot of formats. The next card is kind of in mind of that case that I talked about yesterday. Private Eye for 3 mana. It's a 3/3 homunculus detective. Other detectives you control get +1/+1. So they're going to push the detective creature type really heavily. So there's probably going to be a detective deck in standard and possibly even enough stuff to mess around with it a little bit in commander. And whenever you draw your second card each turn, target detective can't be blocked this turn. So yeah, you draw an extra card and then one of your detectives can get through. And some of them have some pretty impressive attack triggers and whatnot that allow you to let them gut on through and hit your opponent. So I kind of like this. This is going to be an interesting card. And I can see if there's a good enough detective deck in standard that you could, have this as an anthem effect for your detectives and ways to punch them through lines of blockers or whatnot. Then we have Unyielding Gatekeeper. Now, this is an interesting card. I at first I glanced past it, and then I went back as I was scrolling through cards. For 2 mana, you get a 3/2 Elephant Cleric with Disguise, 1 and a white. When it is turn faced up, exile another non-land permanent. If you control it, you flicker it. It goes out and comes back in, so you can reuse your ETBs and that kind of stuff if you want to use it for that. Otherwise, it has a modal option on it. If you exile your opponent's stuff, it's gone, and they get a 2/2 blue-white detective token instead. So their biggest, baddest threat, flip this guy over, and it's gone. They loot, like if they have an Eldrazi or whatever, exile it, and they get this. They get a 2/2. Great, your 11/11's gone. Have a 2/2 instead. And again, like I said, if you need to, you can flicker your own ETB stuff to go ahead and do other things. I think this is kind of interesting in that you can get to do these kind of flickering tricks with this. So I kind of like this. And if there's any way, like I know there's a couple of different ways to turn your creature's face down again. If you can recycle this ability, this is going to be kind of a cool card to have if you have a good way to just flip them back down and reuse that ability. And then we have a new guild leader that was revealed yesterday afternoon after I made my other video. It's Vanifar Evolved Enigma. For 4 mana, it's a 3/4 Elf Ooze Wizard. At the beginning of combat on your turn, choose one. Cloak a card from your hand, which means you just take it, put it onto the battlefield as a 2/2 with Ward 2. You can turn it up anytime for its casting cost if it's a creature. Or put a +1/+1 counter on each colorless creature you control. All these disguised creatures that we've been looking at, those are actually colorless when they are face down, along with, artifact creatures that don't have a color associated with them. It also would count any of the devoid creatures from the Battle for Zendikar block and all those things going on, because those Eldrazi that with devoid, they don't actually have a color, even though there's a color printed on them, they're actually colorless. So like cards like that would work well with this thing. Because at first I was like, why does it count colorless? Then I remembered these disguised creatures, morph creatures, all this stuff, they're colorless. So this is kind of interesting. And it's a beginning of combat trigger. So if you have ways of doubling up the trigger, whether you're cloning her with like a spark double, or you're putting, what is the card? Roaming Throne on elves or wizards or something like that, you can get multiple triggers to either cloak multiple cards onto the board if you want to, or put multiple counters on your colorless creatures to make them bigger. And the cool part about that is with the counters is when you flip them up, they keep those counters. They don't exile and then come back. They just turn over. So those counters are going to stick around to bolster the other side of the card when they get flipped. Then we have the ultimate of the timmiest timmy cards in this entire set, I think. The Pride of Hulklade. It's an 11-drop, 2/15. Now, I did not misspeak that. Crocodile, Elk, Turtle. It costs X less to cast, where X is the total toughness of other creatures you control. So yes, you could, in theory, play a 2/15 for 1 green mana. It also has Defender, which is kind of eh. And then for 2 blue until end of turn, a target creature you control gets +1/+0, gains whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw cards equal to its toughness, and can attack as though it didn't have Defender. So it's a 3/15 if you activate this and make it be able to attack. Ideally, you're going to stick this in something like Arcades the Strategist, something like that, where you're able to deal the back end damage and that walls can attack, defenders can attack without, doing any kind of thing special. You're going to have ways to make this unblockable, or at least close to unblockable. There's a multitude of ways that you can kind of get around this and make it so that it's a 15 on the front side. And this card is gonna get people, their brains are gonna get churning and get brewing with it. I don't know if I am, but if I open one, I might mess around with it a little bit and see what it does. Next, we have a couple of uncommons that I thought were kind of interesting. Now, for the most part, these are mostly in here for limited play. But if you have a deck that cares about sacrificing artifacts or creating thopters or creating little artifact creatures to work with, these next two cards are actually kind of interesting to use in those decks. So this one is Harry Dronesmith. For 4 mana, it's a 2/3 human artificer. At the beginning of your combat, you create a 1/1 Thopter artifact creature token with flying. It has haste, sack it at the beginning of the end step. But the cool thing here is if you have something that cares about artifacts entering or things getting sacrificed, it's going to trigger because you're going to have an automatically sacrificing object coming in. Even if you can't attack with the flyer because they have a blocker, you just let it sit there, sacrifice itself, and go, and you get your triggers. Or you can do this, which is the other part of the cards that I thought was kind of cool here. This is actually a common and uncommon. For 2 in a red, you get Gearbang Orangutan. It's a 2/2 ape with reach. When it enters, you choose one. You can destroy up to 1 target artifact or sack an artifact and put 2 counters on it. So like if you have that Gearsmith out and you create a Thopter, swing with it, and then slam down this, you can sack the Thopter to it and make it into a 4/3. So that's pretty good rate. And it's kind of a cool card, and it also harkens back a little bit to like Uktabi orangutans and stuff like that, where you're able to ETB destroy an artifact or an enchantment with the Uktabis. This one goes after artifacts, or it has the mode like if they don't have an artifact that's worth blowing up, you can at least use this to get a big sized body on the board. Then we have the card that was kind of hinted at by Mark Rosewater in his preview stuff of cards that have abilities on them. This is Persuasive Interrogators. It's a 6-cost, 5/6 Gorgon detective that says when it enters the battlefield, you investigate, and whenever you sack a clue, target opponent gets 2 poison counters. Everybody was kind of suspecting that this was going to be something tied to the Phyrexians, or maybe like a hint towards like a Jace or Vraska being still on the plane of Ravnica. Instead, it's actually a Gorgon detective working with the agency in the story, and they're basically threatening people to turn them to stone or poison them if they don't give up information, which I think is kind of funny. But yeah, if you sack a clue token, and it doesn't matter, you can sacrifice it to something that eats artifacts or whatever. Like you can sacrifice it to a Deadly Dispute, or you can sacrifice it to the Fanatical Devotion, which is from the last set. You're going to be sacking that artifact. You're going to get whatever options those give you, whether because you can create a treasure with Deadly Dispute and draw the 2 cards, or you can create the map token and then draw the 2 cards with the Fanatical Devotion. You'll get to sack that, and then they get the 2 poison counters. So there's some functionality here that's interesting, and there's so many ways to create clues now that I could see this seeing play as kind of a win con in a poison deck of some sort to kind of bolster that type of play out. Then we have our new Wrath effect coming from the set. No Witnesses. For 4 mana sorcery, each player who controls the most creatures investigates, then destroy all creatures. So it's your 4 mana Wrath of God effect, but it looks at the board and goes, all right, who has the most creatures? You get a clue token, and if there's multiple players tied for that, they both get the clue token, and then everything goes kaboom. So this is kind of nice. It's kind of nice to see another 4 mana Wrath. We don't get them very often. Most of the time they're 5 or 6, depending on what color combination you're in. So this is kind of cool. The last couple cards are translations, so we'll see what we get in the end if they're actually translated correctly. The first one is an enchantment aura called Buried in the Garden. For 2 green white, you get an enchant land. When it enters the battlefield, exile target non-land permanent you don't control until Buried in the Garden leaves the battlefield, and whenever the enchanted land is tapped for mana, it adds 1 additional mana of any color. So this is kind of like Ossification, where it's kind of boosted even bigger. So you get Ossification costs 1 and a white, and you have to put it on a basic land. This can go on any land, and it gives you extra mana when you tap that land later, along with the Ossification exile effect. And lands are a lot harder to deal with in the game. So these exile enchantments that go on lands are actually really freaking good. So this is probably going to see play in multiple avenues if you're in a Selesnya color type deck. And the last card is Connecting the Dots. It's an enchantment for 1 and a red. Whenever a creature you control attacks, exile the top card of your library face down. And then you can pay 1 and a red, discard your hand, sacrifice Connecting the Dots, put all cards exiled with connecting the dots into their owner's hands. So this is kind of cool. Bomat Courier existed in Kaladesh, where it was a 1/1 for 1 with haste that when you attacked, you exiled the top card of your library with it. And then you could pay a red and sack the Bomat Courier, and you could put all those cards. You discarded your hand and put all those cards into your hand. So basically, this turns all of your creatures into a sort of Bomat Courier where any of them attacks, you exile a card. So this will do multiple exiles in a turn. If you're attacking with 4 creatures, you're going to get 4 exiles going underneath of this. And then you get to pay and ditch your hand and put those cards in your hand. Because one of the big things with red is it tends to run out of gas, especially later in the game. You're going hard on aggro, burn, whatever. And you can't win if you run out of gas. Well, in this case, if you're using your creatures to attack, have this down. As long as you can activate it and do the thing before they blow it up, you're going to have access to basically an additional hand after 1 or 2 swings. This is actually, as far as I'm concerned, this is a really freaking good card. Because that way you can just be like, swing, put 5 things underneath of this, keep a couple mana open just in case. There's no sorcery speed, thing on there that tells you have to stop it, at least in the translation. So there's nothing stopping you from doing this in response to them blowing it up, trying to blow it up. And so I like this card. It's really good. And I think red decks need something like this to try to combat like their card draw disadvantages that they have when it comes to other colors in the game. So that's what I have for you guys today. These are the only cards I found that are new since yesterday or stuff that I overlooked in the first day. So with that said, I hope you guys enjoyed it, and we will see you in the next video.